Off we go. Now let's just get this viewing. View right. Full screen. There we go. Okay, yep, need to leave. No, full screen. Yes. Present. That's the one. Okay, now we're good. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, wherever you may be. Who do we have with us? We've got this lovely crowd here from Conscious Ground, Andrew and Lisa, my darling at the back there, and Blair from Bangalore 96. 96 as they know here, or as, I call him number 96, but and he's old enough to know what that exactly means. Most of you would not. Number 96 was a TV show in the 1970s on ABC, and it was awfully risque, and children like me and Lisa and probably Blair found themselves parked behind their parents' couch, where we might catch an occasional boob or bum or something. or swear word. Yeah, it was that was the 70s, folks. All right. So today we're going to talk about soils, which so we're at week 11 in our program, and pretty big topic, and one that takes a lot more to understand than a little 2-hour webinar, but I'll do my best. So let's get into it. No, that's not going to work. Okay. So our triptych for the Regrarians platform here is showing somewhat of a transition. And for that, there's a couple of people here who did the forestry workshop that we did on the weekend, and made it fairly clear that in that transition, it's really dependent on the climate as much as anything else. And so the work that we'll go through here, there are some general principles in terms of how one might transition a soil from its current state to where it is. But if you take the foot off the management pedal, in the absence of a full trophic pyramid being in place, which is largely the case, and we'll discuss that further, then it is very difficult without human intervention in particularly dry climates, to have soils continue to get better without any human intervention. That's how much we've affected things over the journey, because we've removed so many organisms out of the system that these systems, were we not to intervene, will actually decline in their health, which is one of those good moments to have at 7 a.m. when you realise the omnipotence of humanity. Okay. Luckily, you're not in that area up here. You're in a humid climate, and so when humans aren't involved in management, the jungle takes over. And so biodiversity actually increases, and soil formation processes tend to increase as a result. The type of soil that's created, though, is quite different to what it would be if we were doing production, which is what a lot of us are interested in here. With this project here at Conscious Ground is a production-based project, whether it's the production of understandings of how to be better earth managers. It's an earth school after all, or how we're going to produce better food, etc. So let's look at some of those transitions and how we might go. Policy, though, first thing that we have from agrarians as a policy with soils is that we need to make topsoil formation the #1 outcome of human habitation. You would have heard Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the famous US president, number 33. He said, the nation that destroys its topsoil destroys itself. And there's a great book that was written in 1938, the same year that quote was given. It was called Topsoil and Civilization, and it basically pointed out that every civilization that had ever existed had that the fundamental cause of their collapse was not because they got obliterated by war or there was some economic issue. It was because they destroyed their topsoil. So it was a topsoil deficit which ultimately caused their demise. So the Mayans, all of these famed civilizations that declined, the Romans, the Romans destroyed all, everywhere north of the Sahara in Africa was a vibrant savanna, which they turned into a granary. You go to the ruins in Tunis and in the old Carthage, all the grain stores. It was all because look at Iraq, the birthplace of wheat. All of those places in these subhumid environments are now deserts as an outcome of tillage-based annual crop production. So things change. Leon Kuntz, I don't know how quite to say his name, but he was a reverend who used to be on the old Sustainable Agriculture Discussion Network group. He since passed, God rest his soul, but he came up with, he was a pretty wild cat. This was back in the 90s when we used to have internet forums before a lot of you were actually out and breathing. And some of you. And when you logged onto the internet and it made lots of noises first. Anyway, there was this really great discussion group back in the day, and he was a pretty active contributor. And like a lot of these sorts of groups, you get pretty wild cats involved. And we were having this debate one day, and Leon just stood up figuratively and said, living soil requires a living mind to understand. It cannot be understood by any melange of the laws of inorganic chemistry. Because we are a living species concerned about the continuation of living, we need to contemplate the living aspects of soils and crops, not just the dead chemistry, unless we would prefer being dead. And it's pretty right. However, most of us modern people have actually got to this point in our journey, having grown up eating dead food from dead soils. So at least in this country here in Australia, we have the largest area in acreage of certified organic production in any country in the world. And yet you have to go looking for an organic farm, right? They're just not that pervasive, are they? Up here, every second farm's organic, of course, yeah, it's pretty hard to find. So most of us have actually got to this point, but what's the byproduct of that? Cancer is everyone has cancer now. Everyone has something going on. It would appear there are lots of maladies. Louis Bromfield. In the 1953, in the presidential election in the United States, he was on Adlai Stevenson's ticket, who opposed Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Adlai Stevenson's proposed Secretary of Agriculture was Louis Bromfield. Louis Bromfield was quite a figure in the United States, and he had a farm called Malabar Farm, and he was an organic farmer at a time when we had this big division in agriculture, because after the Second World War, but even before that, the big divisions in agriculture really occurred in the 1840s when Justus von Liebig was doing his work, and he came up with the idea that we could apply acid to bones and unlock the bond that existed between calcium and phosphorus. So when you bury bone, we find skeletons all the time as archaeologists. And the reason why we find them is because that bond, that chemical bond between calcium and phosphorus is so strong that that the bone is resistant to erosion. Now, what that means from a soil perspective is that bone is resistant to unlocking its minerals. And so Liebig applied acids. That then allowed the minerals in that bone to be available, and so on then went the phosphate revolution. And with the phosphate revolution, then further on, more Germans got involved and Prussians, and the Haber-Bosch process was developed, which initially was developed so that they could synthesize nitrogen using natural gas to produce bombs and armaments. That whole process, a lot of us right now, a lot of the nitrogen that's in our bodies is as an outcome of the Haber-Bosch process. And because that process is still used today to make artificial nitrogen, urea, anhydrous ammonia, and other products which are still used today in conventional agriculture. So you've got these, I find all of the way that all along our journey as humans, we've got these forks in the road, and people take different pathways. In the early 50s, the world went scientific. We finally realized how to deal with atoms and unleashed their power, understood all of that. So, we're starting to really realize how clever we can be. We're also starting to agriculture up to that point had largely been in the materials handling business. In other words, managing shit, because to manage the fertility on a farm was largely done by high levels of labor, spooning out shit and then putting it on the fields and managing teams of horses. Most up until World War II, most farms had horses. So you were in the manure handling business. And you were also growing lots of forage. You were devoting a lot of area of your farm just to feed those horses. So it was a very different world. And so you can imagine in the early 50s when someone comes along and says, here's a bag, you put this into this machine, you drag this by this other machine, which you just fill up with a liquid and you turn it on and you drive. That's pretty compelling. You can kind of understand why people really love the idea of scientific agriculture, tractors, and also all of the herbicides and pesticides and everything. Oh, you don't have to go out and kill your weeds anymore like you did. All of those bugs that we had, we can kill them now. We can be in control of nature. We can express our domain, which of course ties in it back then, because most people were still going and listening to someone on a Sunday at the pulpit, and they too were saying, look how good we are, we've got along, here's our domain being expressed that God gave us, and by God we're going to express it. So to go in a different direction at that point was for some heresy, but also was difficult because a lot of people were saying we should keep a foot in the old camp, and most people are going, are you for real? And we see some of those parallels today as well, as you would appreciate. So Louis Bromfield's an organic farmer who wants to be or who's on the ticket to become the Secretary of Agriculture of the most powerful agricultural nation on the planet. He didn't get in. Dwight Eisenhower got elected, and basically led to the mechanization of America and the power of America that we still have today. And the United States is still the most powerful agricultural nation on the planet. And of here, how about this for a policy? In a cubic foot of good productive soil, one can find the patterns of the laws which govern the universe, laws before which political ideologies, manipulations of currency, shortcuts, and all manner of man-made dodges become singularly silly and puerile. What a lovely word puerile is. It's one of those ones that you can say at a bar, I think, to someone you don't like. Yeah, forks in the road. So recognizing all of that, because I do study history. I study the history of movements. I study, because I think that it informs one. I have a thing where I say, it's important to be strategic, incremental, and pragmatic. If you're not that, as I have not been in my life as well, then you tend to rush in and make a fool of yourself. And so in 2006, when I was presented with the concept from Alan Yeomans, the son of the great P.A. Yeomans, that if all of the world's 5 billion hectares of agricultural land had its soil carbon increased by 1.6%, then that would equal a 100 part per million drawdown of atmospheric CO2. And I went, really? Only that much? Because having worked with soils for 20 years before and looking at soil tests, we were getting that kind of increase in soil carbon pretty regularly. And I thought, well, that's a pretty straightforward deal. Right. So what's the best way to use the $50,000 that we've saved from our job that we were going to build a house with? So we decided, well, and you have to put yourself in the place then, you know, the whole climate thing was really getting off on its legs then in the mid 2000s. And so, you know, like a lot of us, we were subject to, I suppose, to a bit of the alarm and thought, what can we do? How could we have all of this knowledge? How could we understand all of this practice that works and not keep that information to ourselves? So we developed a world tour called the Soil, Water and Carbon for Every Farm World Tour, and went around. We traveled we bought 5 round world tickets for our family. There goes 38 grand. And then got on our bike and organised a whole lot of workshops in which we did all of these trainings to basically let the world know, or the little world that we habitate, this information, because we thought this is really powerful. This means that you, as a producer, you in agriculture, have a really strong role to play in, well, not only supplying the food to everyone in the world, but also to having us all correct this carbon pollution problem. So one of the people who did one of our workshops was John Wick and Peggy Rathman. And this I'm putting this out here not as a brag, but just to show you that you can do things and your voice can be powerful even though you think it may not be. So we're sitting there giving a workshop in a little fire hall in Northern California, and there's a couple of very keen-eyed people sitting in the front row. And I didn't know that they were high net worths. And I didn't know that they were both pretty devoted people once they get on a pathway. So anyway, those 2 people started the Marine Carbon Project, which we went on to help. We helped with the formation of, and etc. And they went on, and now carbon farming is California government policy as a result of that little workshop that we did, and us putting a little bit, putting some of our convenience on the line. It's, we all have opportunities to do that to varying degrees, and I just invite you to think about that and act upon it. And I know a lot of you do. So, and does it get your house built? Does it get all of that going? Well, no, it doesn't necessarily, but there's a lot of land that's being recovered now, and a lot of livelihoods that are being improved, and a lot of the world's species that are being given a home as a result of that sort of thing, which is awfully important. What's going on there? Can't need to click on something, do I? So I work with a genius. His name is Abe Collins, and Abe, most of you will not have heard his name. Abe has developed, and Abe and I were working on the Marine Carbon Project early days as well. Abe's genius is he has a vision to monetize all of the ecosystem processes of the planet, such that agricultural producers don't just produce food, fiber, and energy. They also get paid for the ecosystem services that their agricultural production performs. Now, unfortunately, in most cases, conventional agriculture doesn't actually improve soil, water, and air quality as an outcome. It's getting better than what it was, definitely. No-till agriculture in conventional agriculture has been a boon for that sort of thing. What we can do now with the amount of rainfall that we have in conventional agriculture is incredible. I was talking to a friend recently who produced a 2.5 ton barley crop conventionally using no-till methods with only 125 millimetres of rainfall. Now, and he said he was talking to his father, who in 1983, in a similar rainfall year, had the whole property blow, produced absolutely nothing. The whole property blew away. So, you know, a lot of us will, you know, and that's I think it's a problem of movements, and it's a problem of people, is that when you're working on one pathway and then you have another pathway which is out there as well, we'll often demonize each other, as opposed to going and looking and going, that's good, let's take a bit of that. Anyway, Abe is doing an amazing job at creating some sort of a dashboard for producers, a dashboard for producers in what he calls a sensed landscape. So, and in doing so, with those sensors across the landscape, is assessing things like, what's the water quality that comes through that starts coming through your property, and what's it like when it leaves? What are the infiltration rates that you have across the property? What's that important for? Well, that increases groundwater quality. We've got people that we're working with. There's one farm in Pennsylvania who's getting paid a 6-figure amount for a property that's about 500 hectares. They're getting paid a 6-figure amount annually for the water quality changes, because they're in such a, their catchment goes into a municipal water supply, which has really heavy levels of sediment and nutrient runoff going into it. The opportunity cost which has been realised there is that those farmers, because they practice organic agriculture and a lot of the stuff, or regenerative agriculture as we talk about, their water quality when it leaves the farm is actually better than when it comes in, while still being able to sustain production. And there's an opportunity cost at the municipal level, because the municipality, the value of their water cleaning has reduced the cost of the water plant's filtration costs, treatment costs, such that they are able to pay this client all of that money. All right. So the cost of cleaning water is incredible. And the chemistry that they use now is bad. So any opportunity that we can do, but the problem is in a lot of cases is that we don't have the measurement systems in place to tell us what's going on. So I think a lot of people talk about, you know, genetic modification as being the bright thing that's going to help us feed the 10 billion people that we're going to have in the future of a declining amount of land. I think it's going to be like in Formula One. What made cars go faster in Formula One was not because we made the fuel stronger, it was because we used data. And speaking to you all in front of me here, one of the things that's going to make this place great and make its story great and honest is going to be data. Because anyone who comes here who's got a, you know, from a convent, you know, you're putting your hand up, and a lot of us are putting our hands up saying, we're better. Show me the money. Show me how. So you've got to get a lot more data centric, and people, you know, for us to be able to produce more food, we're going to need to have a lot more data. So that's a real challenge. But fortunately, the cost of sensors and the ways and means, these things here are incredible. We'll start to see a lot more apps that are out and about, which will help us to do a lot more visual monitoring. And visual monitoring is a form of data capture and all of that sort of thing. So a lot of it's got to do with our intent and of observation. We have, you know, with our bifocal vision, We have some of the best powers of observation of any creature on the planet. And with our big noggin and brain, we should be putting those faculties to use. So how do we do it? I'm going to use the work, or the adapted work of the great Dr. Christine Jones, who's an amazing woman from here in Australia, New South Welsh person, I suppose you'd say, Welsh woman. And she's got a website that's called amazingcarbon.com.au. And so I'd recommend any of you who are interested in the work of soil formation, have a look at her great body of work. She works outside of the orthodox scientific community. And of course, having been someone who's worked within that community and then left it, you can imagine that she's got lots of people saying very nice things about her. All right. Notwithstanding, thank you. How did that come out? So she came up with what's called the essential ingredients of soil formation, and I've used this slide from Cornell University in the United States in New York to sort of illustrate the sort of some of the soil formation processes, particularly those that occur in a grassland. The first thing that we need to form soils is sunlight, air, and water. Sunlight obviously drives the system. It catalyzes. It's the energy source that provides the catalyst for photosynthesis, which is all using chemistry, which is in water and air. So you need those three things in a supply. Out of those three, it's usually water which is the limiting factor. And those of you who are up here at the moment, you don't understand that. And a lot of people are living in, well, you know, in this country, drought is the norm. Not being in drought is not the norm. So that's just something. And unfortunately, because of where most of us are from Europe and we've still got our European mindset, we still think that this place is Europe and it should function like Europe, but guess what? It ain't. So, you know, the regular, almost to the clock, and we see this in all of the fertility festivals that we have, which we have also taken. The seasons in Europe are almost to a clock. When we come out here, there ain't no clock. It's reliably unreliable. So something to understand and appreciate and try and live with and try and plan around. An old friend, Ken Bellamy, did a PDC with me back in the day when I taught those. I did one up near Cairns in Mareeba. And when we were talking about soils, he said, do you mind if I get up and have a bit of a rave about soils? Because I was talking about plant photosynthesis. And he said, guess what? Plants aren't the only things that photosynthesize. And I said, yeah, I know. Well, tell me more. I don't know a lot about this. And he said, how about we talk about photosynthetic bacteria photosynthesis? And I went, yeah, cool. Let's talk about them. The cyanobacteria. And so he said, one of the reasons how Australia functions and how it has functioned in this, environment of really in different climatic conditions, in different water supply, he said it's because photosynthetic bacteria that live in the soil make water through a different pathway, through a different photosynthetic pathway to what plants do. So here we are at the top, we have plants. So you've got carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Oh, sorry, the second one down. You've got carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you've got water, you've got light energy, which is the energy supply to that, which then catalyzes a process, which then splits all of that out and produces sugars, complex sugars, polysaccharides, oxygen, and water. So you convert that chemistry using that energy source to create those compounds. Cool. Right, now in the ground, you got a bit of light. Light comes through, which he was saying to me, yeah, it's incredible. What they found is that light comes through as latent light late in the day. So light finds its way by refracting off the alumina particles, which are most soils are made up of. The stuff that you touch and feel are made up of aluminium and silica particles, and they're crystals, fairly reflective. So you've got all this light which goes down, goes through the fissures of the soil, and then gets refracted, and that becomes the energy source for these bacteria, who are also feeding off the byproducts of anaerobic decomposition, which also occurs in the soil. So their hydrogen source is not water, it's hydrogen sulfide, which is rotten egg gas, which comes from, you know, when you've got a shitty old septic tank and you lift the lid off that one, you go, whoa, or your compost tea's been unattended. Whoa. Right. So so you got your CO2, which is readily available as well, because that's the outgas from anaerobic decomposition. So you've got the outgases from the two major decomposition processes which are occurring in the soil from anaerobic and aerobic. These photosynthetic bacteria are able to catalyze all of these compounds, including water and sulfur. We import sulfur and put it onto soils. Most of it comes these days as a byproduct of oil refinement. So we've either got pure sulfur deposits, most of which are in Canada, and a few other areas where we've got some volcanism. There's young children harvesting blocks of sulfur in active volcanoes as we speak in Indonesia right now, and that goes into the world sulfur supply. Of course, they're getting paid very well for their risk and short lives. And then we've got it coming from oil production. So a lot of oil refineries produce not just low sulfur diesel. Where does that sulfur go? It goes into the sulfur supply, which is then put onto agricultural landscapes. So how did the earth function without all of these Indonesian children mining sulfur or us having oil refining plants? Well, it did it because there were organisms taking care of things. But what we've done, and this was the really big point here for me, the takeaway, I said, wow, all right, so what's the life cycle of these organisms? He said, well, they all, generally, nearly all photosynthetic bacteria have part of their life cycle in going through the digestive system of an animal, of a grazing animal. So here we would have in Australia them going through the various marsupials that habitate this continent. Other continents, it would be other grazing animals. And guess what we've done in agriculture largely? We've turned many of our landscapes into vegetarian landscapes. And of course, now we go and pump water onto them. Now we go and pump sulfur onto them. I mean, even in organic agriculture, we use sulfur. So see where I'm going with this? There's an ecological underpinning to our operating systems here that a lot of us are denying our systems of. And it's one of the reasons why when people go and shift, and I'll talk more about this, when people go and shift livestock back into their cropping systems, that they see very, very fast shifts in the way that those systems work, because they're starting to operate like ecologies do. I'm sorry to say that there are no vegan or vegetarian ecologies that exist. We have diets which may work that way, and that's absolutely fine. But we should, under pretty well no circumstances, pretend that you can have an ecological agriculture that doesn't have a full array of the trophic partners involved. So that's just the way it is. If you don't want to eat them, that's fine, but don't deny a landscape of them. So it's really important to understand that, and then understand how, or the values of us taking that pathway, of us trying to extend photosynthesis for the longest period possible. Because a lot of what we do in agriculture, and we'll see some of this here, we'll have areas right now which are not engaged in, which don't have photosynthesis above them right now. Like, we'll cultivate fields and we'll leave them rest. Well, that's a sort of an old technique, really. And here in modernity, we're finding this more and more all of the time, that the best thing for us to do is to try and keep the pathway. I'll just go back up for this, actually. We'll try and keep this pathway of liquid carbon in the form of polysaccharides continuing to feed into the soil. Think about if tomorrow all of the banks closed and there was no cash. Your cards didn't work. Your cash, all of your pockets miraculously were empty of cash. Think of tomorrow where you're in a field and you're a group of soil microlife, and the cash flow stopped. The cash flow of the soil is sugar. And without that energy continuing to flow, activity stops. Just as if I took all of your cash supply away tomorrow. Well, today's Tuesday, isn't it, Danny? So it's an important day for a lot of people that conscious ground. When you do your invoices, it's on the fridge. Right? Don't pay your invoices. Everyone stops paying their invoices. Life starts to get a bit shitty, doesn't it? So it's the same in the soil. So imagine, and we see this when we look at when we study through the microscope the soil activity. You see that, you know, we feed all of these organisms up, and then we take away the cash flow, and their populations just dive. And which is, we now know that that's not what we don't have to do that. We can actually grow plants symbiotically. The syntropic agriculture people, of course, understand that, or syntropic successional, whatever they call it, agroforestry, depending on whether you're whose pathway you're on, or whose friend you are with, whatever the case. Nature doesn't stop generally, only when temperature is in the way. And temperature is the usual limiting factor. Nature doesn't stop photosynthesizing if it can. It's us that stops that from happening. It's only when we get low temperatures that it stops. And that's not the case here. So cultivation-based agriculture, where we don't have, where we have really prolonged period of no photosynthetic activity, is crazy in a solar saturated environment where the temperatures never get low enough for something not to grow. And so that's something that we need to think long and hard about. Now, that's what we have here with two brothers. This is one brother, a younger brother, and this is an older brother. And they both had a fork in the road. They had a major fire on their conventional farm go through in, I think, about 1982. One came out of that fire and burned, physically burned, the younger brother. And they lost everything, all their houses, all their fencing, all their animals, basically it was a total fire. Now, just to hold that point, Charlie Massey, who wrote the great book, The Call of the Reed Warbler, which was basically an outcome of his PhD thesis as a 64-year-old at ANU, he interviewed me as part of that book. And he said to me, you know what? He did a survey of hundreds of farmers across Australia as part of his research for the book, and he said, that the main reason, like 80+% reason why most people went from being conventional producers to organic, ecological, whatever you want to call them, producers, was because something bad happened in their life. It wasn't because they woke up one morning and went, hey, I'm going to be an organic farmer because I get better prices, or something like that, or I'm on some world-saving kick. It was because someone in the family got cancer, or generally something like that. It was a personal health-related issue, or there was an economic collapse within their enterprise and they needed to go looking for something else. So a fairly major change and high-stress change was what caused the transition. And that follows through with Everett Rogers' discussion on the diffusion of innovation, in that about 15% of the world's population are made up of innovators and early adopters, and then the rest of the population are made are people who follow them. And it's the it's that flows through to agricultural populations as well. So anyway, one of these brothers in that recovery has a beer with a mate, and they're saying, I want to grow more autumn feed. How do you reckon I could do that? And he said, well, why don't, and they've got to their landscape's recovering, and he said, well, why don't we sow some oats into the pasture, which is not an unusual thing, but let's do it without we've got no money because we're all poor at the moment because we've had a big fire and the insurance only covered so much and we're in recovery mode. So let's do that. So they both tried it, and hey presto, it worked. And from then came the concept of what's now known as mixed species pasture cropping. And so this brother here has gone on to do that, and he now in 20 years has a soil profile where his root zone is down to 1 metre, and he's increased his soil carbon by about 4% down to that depth. So he's been able to sequester in that period the equivalent to, on average, about 20 tonnes, about 19.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for every year on every hectare over that period. Now, if everyone who did agriculture in the world did that, there would be none of these climate conferences going on. None of it. There'd be none of this carbon blah blah going on, because it'd all be over. Simple as that. He does that by, at the same time as producing now the same cereal crop yields as everybody else using the full weight of conventional agriculture. So while still be able to sequester carbon and not have any cultivation. So as I think that pasture cropping as a program is probably the biggest development in agricultural history. Because when we look at the damage that's being caused by tillage, I mean, if Colin Sykes and Darrell Clough were Roman generals in North Africa, and they said after they'd quelled all of the North Africans, and said, all right, well, we're going to get out there and do some no-kill or pasture cropping, North Africa would look very, very, very different today. In fact, it had probably been improvement on what it was, such as the power of this stuff. The brother across the fence, he still practices conventional agriculture and provides a very nice contrast for soil profiles, which surprisingly he allows his brother to continue to take. But this just goes to show the recalcitrance of some humans, that even though, and this is something to bear witness to any of you here, I mean, one of the things we talked about yesterday about being a model. Being a model to whom? To all of those legions of conventional people out there whose personality types are that they are part of the late majority or that they are recalcitrant. and will go to their grave not wanting to change, and who happen to manage most of the agricultural landscapes of the planet, yeah, good luck. I wish you very good luck. But this is the thing. Even the great story, Joel Salatin, a lot of you would know, and the Polyface film that we made, and you've seen quite a few of you saw that the last time we were here. This bloke there called Oakley. Oakley drives up and down that driveway every day, and has for 40 years, because his farm is at the back of Polyface Farm. So he has to drive through Polyface Farm to get to his farm on the aptly named Pure Meadows Lane. So he drives up Pure Meadows Lane every day for 40 years. He finally comes up to the Salatins, who've gone from being, a little hokey family doing their stuff, blah, 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 building up. Now they've got a $5 or $6 million business on 100 acres. It's hothouses everywhere, 30 people there full time. It's quite unlike a farm that you've ever seen. It's like everyone here working full time with polytunnels, with inventory, with stuff, just with trucks coming in, stuff just pumping out, right? It could be a vision of this place. Go there and you'll sort of go, oh, right, that's how this place could really go, right? Anyway, so he's witnessed that over 40 years, and he finally goes up to Joel and says, do you think I could have a bit of a crack at that? Yeah. Biologically available minerals. Really important. A lot of people in this space follow the work of different gods. So we spoke about this at the forestry workshop the other day. There's the Alan Savory god. There's the P.A. Yeoman's god. There's the Christine Jones, Elaine Ingham, a whole range of different gods. The Rudolf Steiner god, right? And they're our god. And because we've all been raised to be monotheistic, we're quite loyal. Because it's pagan to be polytheistic. So, of course, we're quite loyal to these people. And, and I'm sure that within this community, you're all laughing because some of you have those different gods in here, and there's a little bit of tension going on. Yeah. Because the Steiners are up against the Inghams and so on, and off it goes. Right. All right. Well, I'm obviously a bit more polytheistic, but one of the things that I see in places like this, and Danny and I talked about this yesterday when we were inspecting the lychee crop and testing it for its fruit. We were doing testing of the bricks levels. Yep. I have an internal refractometer because I also use the Reams method, of course. Anyway, that minerals are really important. Someone said to me yesterday, you're nothing but a set of animated minerals walking around. I said, well, I've never been insulted so nicely. Minerals are in animation, and a lot of us will focus on the biology of things. And that's where I would say, a lot of the focus, so with Elaine Ingham's work, which Elaine's a friend and I really respect what she does. But I think that in a lot of cases, what we do is we bias over towards the biology without appreciating that the soil is really made up of physical factors, which are largely driven by the soil's chemistry, inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry, and that water is the key driver of the relative health. So if you've got a soil which is dry and you go and put compost tea on it, probably not much is going to happen except the death of the organisms that are in that compost tea. And so if you're in a dry area or a dry climate, it's really important to appreciate that. However, if you've got, that's all good. And if you're trying to get a system to actually get up and going, one of the best things that you can do is engage with soluble minerals. We do this all of the time, and I've seen it all of the time because I've practiced and I've had clients who've practiced pretty well every weird and every sub-weird bit of thing you've ever thought of. And they come back to me and say, hey, we're finding that just didn't work. Because we've said, we've hired Elaine Ingham, we've had her come out and do courses through the Region Ag Workshop series. And before that, I had her working with in the United States with our carbon farming and carbon economy series. And the feedback was generally in the areas where landscapes were humid, that it was really great. But when we put that work into areas where the landscape was not humid, it didn't work. So, or where rainfall was very seasonal, it didn't work as well as it could. But when it was humid in that year and we used those sorts of techniques, it worked really well, right? So water is important with this. If plants are growing and there's no rainfall, a way to get minerals into them is through their stomata. And so one of the things that we found when we went to Mexico years ago was a group of Latin Americans who were part of an organization, a cooperative called COAS. People such as Eugenio Gras, Jairo Restrepo, and Sebastião Pinheiro. And those characters are all, Sebastião and Jairo are all conventionally trained agronomists who, what they've done is they've taken all of the knowledge that we've been able to build up in conventional agriculture and shift that over to helping campesinos. And what they do is they train campesinos how to shift away from being conventional producers over to being organic producers, because these people have these people are at the bottom of the food chain as far as they're at the bottom of the food chain as far as the excesses of the commodity-driven globalist economy, and especially in Mexico and Latin America, particularly Mexico post-NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement, which our dear friends, the darlings of the left, the Clintons, put in the 1990s. Yes, let's not go there. Anyway, that decimated a lot of campesino agriculture in Mexico. That Free Trade Agreement, and continues to be highly problematic. Anyway. These characters come along and say, all right, you've got the arse out of your pants. You're always one rainfall event away from not just leaving your farm, but from actual starvation. So how can we help? Well, we've got our privileged education. Let's go and unravel some of these techniques and get some of this stuff so that it'll work for you, and not just work for you, but it will work for you. You can rely on this. So, for example, they took Justus von Liebig's stuff from the 1840s on how to unlock or break the calcium phosphorus bond, and here's the formula that's going on here, written on a bit of concrete. And so what they do is they burn bones. They say, go around, you're looking for phosphorus. At the moment, you're going and buying phosphorus from an American company or a Mexican oligarch, and you're buying that phosphorus. You got phosphorus all around you. And they go, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, well, it's all in the bones. So go and pick all the bones up from all your dead animals off the roadside or whatever, and let's burn them. Let's put them through a process, and now we'll make something called fosfito. So now you're phosphorus independent. That's a really big step for someone who grows vegetables, or because you're exporting, whenever you're a vegetable producer, you're exporting minerals like they're going out of fashion. So that was what they did there. And they went on to do that for a whole range of other minerals as well. So lime, sulfur, you name it. They go and find sources that are in the environment that are generally sitting there not doing anything because their mineral concentrations have not been recognized, or they haven't, or that people haven't had the knowledge to be able to unlock the minerals that are otherwise not available. So they do a lot of that sort of thing, which is fantastic. Let's just talk a bit further about that in terms of minerals. Livestock know where minerals are. A lot of trees, farmers see their trees getting eaten, their bark getting stripped off trees and all sorts of things, who are livestock producers, because cattle go and are looking for minerals. Because cattle are browsers in nature, so they live in, they're what you might call a woodland species. Any species that has a cleft hoof spends some of its time in forest, because that's a physiological adaptation to lifting its heavy body in muddy conditions. And you tend not to find muddy conditions in grasslands, because grasslands have such dense root systems that perennial grasslands don't have a lot of mud. It's not until you get right down into the lowlands. Forests, on the other hand, their surface is not covered with grass. It's covered with leaf mold, with leaf litter. And so, of course, leaf litter doesn't hold the soil together, as well as a mat of fine filamentous roots. So understand that. We also look at the dentition of cattle and sheep and goats. I mean, goats, everyone appreciates, is a browser. The dentition of a goat is not that different to the dentition of a cow. And yet we all recognise that goats are browsers, but we don't with cattle. And that's one of the reasons why some of the better producers out there now incorporate edible browse for their cattle, right? And that gives them a lot of the minerals that their incredible rumination enables. Follow on from that, this is a friend of mine, Jimmy Elizondo. These are some Mashona cattle, which are a brilliant African beast. I'm surprised that they're not everywhere through here, because they're such a great animal. They're resistant to all of the flies. They have they're really, really adaptable to subtropical and tropical conditions. They're a low frame score, so they're much more efficient at feed conversion. They're just great animals. But they're African, and we, of course, being European, have a bias towards European or continental breeds. And we even kind of look. You laugh, but I'm serious. It's just the psychology that goes into so many things is fascinating. It's a pathological psychology. Anyway, this is on a property in Florida. And this property was 1,200, I consulted on it, was 1,200 acres, and it had been an oak tree nursery for 30 years. If you can imagine 1,200 acres of 8-inch pots, right? Only in America, right? And they produced oak trees, 8-inch pots on weed mat, right? And the whole property was set up that way, and they round up 9-10 times a year. Even the weed mat, being in a tropical climate, the weeds just come through. So anyway, the guy who bought it, a high net worth, bought this place. Anyway, so he buys this joint, pulls up all of the weed mat, and because he's got the grazing bug, he said, "I want to grow cows." Just wakes up one morning, "I want to grow cows." Finds Jimmy Elizondo Braun, who's a friend of ours, and says to Jimmy, "Can I grow cows?" He said, "Yeah, no worries. Let's get to work." So what happens successionally? Now this is in Florida, and Florida is a lot of sand, and we can't find the bottom of the sand, so it's a sandbox. So you can imagine stripping off, on a bit of sand. You've round upped it 9 times a year for 30 years, and you've had weed mat over the whole lot, right? It's not going to be much organic matter in there, right? Or life. So it pulls all that off. Nature wants to grow. Bit of rain. What comes up? What's the first thing that comes up? Couch grass, Bermuda grass. And so now, is couch grass a good forage? Oh, it's appalling, right? We have to recognize that any forage that has a protein content of less than 8% will have the animal atrophy. In other words, it will consume its own flesh to get its protein, daily protein needs. Not what one generally does when you're a livestock producer. You're in the weight gain business, not the not the weight loss business. Anyway, so how do you deal with that? Well, in this case, as a starting point, some protein supplementation. So he was able to get some protein meals, which allowed him to do that. But what about the minerals? There's no minerals in this stuff. You know, you got a sandbox where there's no life and there's no mineral exchanges going on to provide those minerals. So Jimmy got this company called Free Choice Minerals, who have buffered individual minerals. So you've all heard probably of stock blocks and all of that sort of thing, you know, mineral blocks, molasses blocks and all of that sort of thing, where you've got a composite, kind of like when we have multivitamins, right? This is the livestock version. You put these out and the animal takes whatever's in that block. And those blocks have been roughly devised for the general mineral deficiencies in any given area. So if you go and buy blocks anywhere in Australia, those blocks will be composed of the minerals which are generally missing in that region's soils, right? But like when you have multivitamins, when you take the multivitamins, a lot of people say, gee, even though I'm drinking a lot of water, my pee's still brown. That's because your body is not accepting the minerals and it's coming out through your urine, right? Well, one of the things that goes on with this free choice minerals is that an animal like this one can self-select. Now, in humans, the only stages in a human's life in modernity when humans do this is when women are pregnant and crave, and children. And children practice something that some cultures still practice, and that's called geophagy. And geophagy is when you cook in earth, right? And they cook people, ancient peoples and tribal people still today, cook in earth because they recognize that using some earths gives them mineral supplementation, right, on top of what they will get out of their foods. Kids do it, and you know, now we've got kids who are not allowed to play in the dirt, of course, because dirt's yucky. But of course, most healthy people, when they grew up, had access to dirt, and they were putting their fingers in their mouths, taking up dirt all the time, right? And pregnant women sit there saying, I want chocolate, give me chocolate, right? Or whatever it is, and it just comes out of nowhere. They may have hated chocolate before, or they might have hated cabbages or whatever it was. Give me it. All right. Same with this cow. It knows what's on the other side, so it's going for it. Now, with these boxes, they're each buffered minerals, and so the cow goes up, and it goes. So instead of taking a multivitamin, if it detects that it's low in phosphorus in that paddock, it will eat the phosphorus or lime or whatever it is. And of course, then it works as one would do ordinarily and get a soil test. So I say, you know, who would you prefer to trust? A lab and a person in a coat with an agronomic degree doing a soil test, or would I prefer a cow? I'd go with the cow every bloody time. Cow doesn't have anything to sell apart from its body and body fluids. That's it. Doesn't know it's going to sell them yet either, but that's another question. So that's one way of going down that pathway of mineral supply. The other way is to actually go and do soil testing, and then it's a matter of, oh goodness me, which soil test god do I follow? Yeah, now we're getting complicated. And you know, what's the value in all of this? And what we've seen is that over the journey, I've done literally thousands of soil tests in my career, and I've gone off them. I've gone off them, gone on them, gone off them, gone on, mainly because I see the results from our clients and I see the amount of money that they spend. And this is where I come back to, because agriculture is the game of producing food, fiber, and energy products to meet consumer demand, and doing so that you spend less than you earn. That's ultimately the game. But what the fine balance on being able to do that and do it so that your land doesn't suffer is trying to spend less than you earn and trying to have a profit so that you can put that profit into things that you want to do as a farmer, which if you look at most of the farmers I've ever talked to are all into the idea of improving their land in some way, shape or form. So how do you do that? Whilst how do you maintain agricultural production profitably whilst putting on all of these inputs? It's a really tough game. So we find ourselves using the Albrecht method a lot, and people like Bruce Davison we work with a lot. He's a grazier down near Bega, who's trained himself as an agronomist. So he's a farmer agronomist, not an agronomist farmer. So he looks at agronomy through the lens of a farmer and farmer productivity and profitability. And so instead of, like a lot of agronomists will just, they will not provide you with a regime of mineral supplementation that considers your economy, right? You need this much, this much, this much. There's your prescription. How you deal with that financially is not my problem, right? As opposed to someone like a Bruce, and there's a few of these people emerging, they go, okay, well, let's start with your economy. Let's start with your context. Let's understand that, and then let's work together on some sort of a program of recovery. That's a much better way to go. Whichever soil mineral god you use, because they're all pretty well the same, really. But the soil tests are all interesting. So one of the things I find really interesting is carbon. So you can see here on this particular, now this is from a lab, which is one of the labs that probably as many organic farmers use this lab as anyone else. It's APEL in South Australia, Australian Perry Agricultural Lab. Been around for a long time. They follow the Albrecht method. They say that colloidal organic matter should be between 4 and 6%. Right? That's because, to an extent, they've got some of their agronomists went to agricultural college, and at agricultural college right now, they will be saying it this morning at 9 o'clock when they talk about organic matter, they say, you should not have any more than 2% organic matter, because if you have any more of that, then it's going to rob your crop of nitrogen. Yeah, I find it. I go all over the world and talk to agronomists all over the world, and that's agronomic orthodoxy, which is incredible. But there's this pushback as well, because people are going, oh, hang on, there's all of this other information out there that's saying that we should actually have higher levels of organic carbon because that helps with good mineral exchange. It helps with keeping the soil more open and well structured, and clay and organic matter or organic carbon is a colloid. It's a material onto which minerals stick. So clay is a colloid. It's a gel in the soil when it's wet, and it's got a negative charge, and positively charged minerals stick to it and are exchanged in the soil water. Organic matter is the same. So you get that. So let's go to another. This is Australia's biggest soil testing organisation. This is called Pivot Insight-Tech, and they provide more to anybody else. Now you can see here, organic carbon, 2.1%, very high, right? So this is, you can see where I'm going here. We're living in this parallel world where we've got orthodoxy, the people in power. Go and try and change the information that's delivered out of a university in a hurry. Yeah, good luck. Complex organisations and institutions and their knowledge pathways are really, really recalcitrant to change. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing a very, I think we're seeing a very, we're getting to a point where here in Australia, we're at about 10% uptake of organic agriculture. As I said, one of the highest levels in Australia. And we're getting to a point where I think the big limiting factor is policy. And what informs policy in the agricultural sector? Science. And the science has a particular set of orthodox principles that they follow. And one of those is right there in that, staring in our face, 2.1% being very high. What's the basis to organic agriculture and regenerative agriculture? High levels of organic carbon in our soils. On it goes. Anyway, dear Elaine, living things in our soil. So we need all of this stuff. We need minerals, we need sunlight, water, light, air. We need organisms and a whole, and their trophic movement and exchanges. So with that, we need to appreciate what's going on in the soil, and that's something that I think Elaine has done probably more for than any other human that's ever existed, in identifying not only the individuals but the orders, and painting it and putting it in a way that, even though she's a we've got a little hunter over here. This is talking about trophic pyramids. This one is is a second order carnivore, but an obligate carnivore who currently thinks there's something to hunt. So Elaine's done a great job with that. She's also helped us, as a few other people have, to help us understand what, in this balance between the bacterial world and the fungi world, just what proportion we want to have in production systems, where we're producing particular kinds of crops. And this is a real challenge for agroforestry, for example. Grab it while you can. This is a real challenge for people in agroforestry, because in agroforestry, what we're trying to do is we're trying to grow really healthy tree crops, and we're trying to grow really healthy grass crops, or crops which prefer a different balance of fungi to bacteria in the soil. And so how do you manage that effectively and economically? The syntropic systems that are becoming more and more popular, and we've all been looking at more and more of, for I think good reason. It's got to be a big challenge of growing vegetable crops in between what are ostensibly forest crops, when it comes to what's the right balance between bacteria and fungi in those soils. That's a whole other discussion. Next thing, let's move this. Can I? Yeah. No, can't move it out of the way. Oh, goodness. Excellent. Oh, whoa. Hang on. View. Present. Yeah, living things on the soil. Is that little panel in the way there? I think it is. I can't do much about it. Yeah, living things on the soil. And this is where a lot of agricultural enterprises, I think, as I stated from the outset, have gone wrong. Just got a chat item there. Just bear with me. Can't see it. Okay. I've just got someone who's online who said something. I just better check on that. Where are we? Chat. Yes, Ray and Samantha have pointed out there is a difference between organic carbon and organic matter. Very good point. Thank you, Ray and Samantha, up in near Stanthorpe there. Of course, so organic matter is, I think, 27 times more, 27 times less organic carbon than organic carbon is. So although there's a bit of debate around even the existence of humus these days. But yeah, there's a big, so organic carbon one can classify as material. Well, the way I look at it, it's material. It's carbon material where it's got into its final stage of decomposition. It is now nothing much is going to eat it. Like so it's become relatively stable as a result. Whereas organic matter, there's a whole food chain that's going to start consuming that. Consume it, shit it, consume it, shit it, consume it, shit it. It's the final shit, you might say, organic carbon, right? Right. All right, living things on the soil. So these are really great things to have. A lot of landscapes and production systems have had this taken out of them. And so we have to do a lot of work to overcome that. Things annoying. Yeah, come on. This is from David Tongway, and forgive me for those of you who did the forestry program on the weekend, but we'll go through this again. Landscape function is something that David Tongway from CSIRO has come up with, and trying to develop ways in which we can look at the ways that animals function on landscapes. And so for someone like Andrew here, who's a grazier, you know, a big part of his game is trying to balance animal performance with the grassland performance, because, you know, it's the grassland that produces his animals ultimately. And so you've got to keep an eye on that, but you've also got to keep an eye on the animal and how it's performing. And so you've got to really, so it comes to me as no surprise that a lot of the key figures in regenerative agriculture are actually livestock producers, because they have to keep an eye on two very dynamic different levels of two different trophic levels. But if you're just, I'll put this in the nicest way possible, but if you're just a plant producer, then you don't have to pay attention to the animal systems, and so your observation is not diluted, as it were, and perhaps not as integrative. When you're a livestock producer, you are looking at, in a regenerative sense, you're looking at more facets of the trophic levels than you are when you're just a plant producer. I shouldn't say just, but you know what I mean. So, but when it comes to landscape function is large, and its quality is largely driven by the quality and the integrity, I should say, of the trophic levels. So do you all understand what trophic levels mean? So trophic levels are where you've got different, otherwise known as the energy levels. So you've got vegetation, which is driven by the sun, air, and water supply. It then produces vegetation, or vegetation is vegetation. Then the sum total of vegetation is 1/10 of the amount of sunlight that comes into a square meter. So if you have X amount of kilojoules or megajoules of sunlight that come onto an area, that the vegetation that's there under ideal conditions will be 1/10 of that energy supply in joules. And then that will support 1/10 the energy of animals. So if you've got 10 tons of biomass, then that will support 10 ton, that'll produce 1 ton of herbivores, right? Including insects and everything, right? Everything that's having a crack at that vegetation. And then they will support 1 ton, so 100 kilos of omnivores. And then they will support 10 kilos of carnivores. Right? That's the trophic pyramid. That's pretty well, there's a little bit of difference on the 10%. Where's that 90% going? Heat losses. So whenever you have decomposition, you have heat loss. Whether it's in our guts or in the gut of anything, there's heat loss as a result of that. And our body's just exuding heat all of the time, as all animals do. or organisms do. So that's what happens there. Now, if we go and try and manifest that in our observations of a landscape, one of the best things to do is to look at the soil surface. So when you go out there and you try and assess to see whether a landscape's going okay or not, you can do all sorts of sensing and you can do all sorts of tests, or you can just look at the soil surface. And the soil surface being the main interface between the atmosphere and the lithosphere. Right, so the interface between two spheres of this planet. You've got hydrosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere. That being a key interface, there's a lot of stuff going on, and most people don't pay attention to it. Well, now you're going to, because that's where most of the mineral exchanges are. Just like the border between the hydrosphere, the ocean, and the coastline, the lithosphere is where you get the richest exchanges. Right? So, of course, great place to go and snorkel. Go and snorkel in the middle of the ocean and see what you see. Right? Not much going on. Right? So, snorkel. Here we go. Snorkel on your soil surface. Right. I think that's an interesting photo coming up. There he is in his wetsuit. With snorkel. Yeah. So pay attention to soil cover, the basal cover, or the total surface area of root system of plants across a landscape. And what are all of these different things telling us? How much litter cover do we have? Is that litter decomposing actively? And so on. Do we see any erosion? Is there much micro-topography that's enabling a lot of infiltration to go on, and so on and so forth? So they're the sorts of things that you can observe on the surface. There's other methods which are similar. This is in the Regrarian's Handbook in the geography chapter. This was developed by Nathan Swire and Kirk Gadzia. It's called the bullseye technique. So here you've got a bullseye, and you can go out there with a chart and you can look at very similar parameters, bare ground, erosion, plant pedestaling, all of those things. And you can mark in your bullseye with the center part of the bullseye being gold. That means you're achieving your goal. Silver meaning you're moving towards or away from your goal. Or bronze meaning you're not achieving your goal. So you've got all of those parameters on a bullseye, a little graphic, and you can very simply go out to anywhere in your ecosystem, on your farm system, and go pop, 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 pop. Now I'm done. Now I've got a graphical representation of my soil health. And from that, you can then deduce the soil indicators. Have I got stability? Have I got good infiltration? And have I got good nutrient cycling? Because we understand all of these factors now. So that means you don't need to go out and do any testing per se. You can just use what you've been given, and that's a brain and some eyes. And that's it, and a little bit of knowledge and a bit of paper. So really, really helpful tools. And I think, we were talking yesterday here about monitoring and how it would be great to tell the story over time. People, taking before and after photos and all of those sorts of things, which are really compelling, you might say, arguments towards going down a particular pathway. Well, so's the data. Like if I could say, all right, well, here's the bullseye from 2019 of our pastures or this area or that area, or here's the soil mineral analysis if you want to go down to that depth, or here's the soil biology, and it's 2025 and we're all looking at this place and we're flicking through on the website and people are going, oh, wow, that place has really improved or it didn't. And there's a story behind that. Further to that is these, we're working on the Regrarian's Handbook, and one of the things that we've done is, this is for the forestry chapter, which has not been produced yet, and trying to illustrate the differences. And this is another part of how we're playing out, the way we're playing our game is we're saying, all right, well, there's a way that you might be operating now, and it is what it is. Let's just be cool on that, because you have a whole context which has brought you up to this point. and we should be judging really what's happened before then. But let's say that we're sitting across the table here, as I find myself regularly across the table from a conventional producer who's looking to not be conventional anymore. So what do? You say, oh, gee, everything you've done, you start the conversation saying, gee, everything you've done is really bad. You're a bad person, right? You've got bad landscape, everything's bad. You've been using chemicals, blah, blah. It's just bad, 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 right? And they're just good. It's not, oh, I've just got a punch in the mouth and told to fuck off, right? So they're the two alternatives that could happen here. Personally, I try and say, all right, well, that is what it is, right? None of us, there's one thing that's an absolute certainty, we can't do anything about what we did before, right? So that's it. So what we say is, all right, well, what can we do within the context of you right now? Because that's our game, really. Oh, well, that's the game that I work in. My game is I want to see where you are and where your family is and where your financial situation is, and I want to see where your landscape is and where it is and how its family of organisms are working. And generally, when we ask people what their holistic context is, they want to see an improvement in both. Right? When they're asked, they want to see their family and their land get better, their circumstances get better, right? So how do we do that? What are the tools that we'll use? Well, let's understand what we're doing now and what it's doing. And let's say, all right, well, we're a conventional producer. And we'll say, all right, well, you're doing X, Y, and Z. What are some of the ways that you might move ahead straight away? Well, let's say you're a vegetable producer and you use, so we might go straight away and look at your books. And most people would say, oh, well, let's go and have a look at your production system. No. What's stopping you probably from being a better producer is because financially you're under the pump. So the best way to get you to regenerate your system is not as most people would think. It's not necessarily to go straight out and do something on the ground. It may be in your accounting. It may be in what you're buying. What are your choices? So, and we might go in and go, have you thought, so we'll see, there's your fertilizer bill, for example. You might go, all right, what are those fertilizers that you're buying? Have you thought, therefore, of shifting over to this fertilizer because this fertilizer or this mineral supplement costs this much less and will give you exactly the same outcome, right? So it's not always, I'm just trying to make the point that if you are looking at your own situation or if you're working with others, you really need to be truly holistic with this. You need to take a holistic approach, and a holistic approach is where you're looking at not just the environmental and not just the social, but also the financial realms. And it's going to be, and it's in the identification of the weak links that exist within any of those streams. So what are the financial weak links? What are the social weak links? What are the biological weak links? There'll be them in somewhere, but it'll be which of those should we prioritize first of all? Which are the weakest links which are influencing the whole the most? And that's something that you need to self-acknowledge. And so obviously you can't do that by pointing the finger, right? Whether it's at yourself and being hard on yourself or others, you've actually got to be pretty open about this. And with some people, quite gentle. And that's something to assess. It's a very challenging thing as a consultant to come and sit at the table for the first time with people who you've never met. And because most consultants, when they go in, they're consulting on a financial issue. They're consulting on a biological issue. They're consulting on a social issue. They're not consulting necessarily on all of it, and having to identify straight away which one is the one that's hurting the most. And that can be pretty hard on those people to say, yeah, I've heard, yeah, especially producers. So animals on the ground, really important to have them. I think one of the things, this is a photo I took at one of Polyface Farms, lease farms. Not a bad little pasture, a bit of chicory, a bit of this, bit of that. Still it's only a year into their program, so it hasn't had the chooks on it or anything like that to boost up its height and volume, but not a bad little pasture. Quite diverse, probably about 30 species in it. Anyway, cows have just been moved. I'm on the ground standing next to this darling. That's her same spot about 10 minutes later. Now, one of the things that livestock can do, and this is one of the transformations that we'll have perhaps on this place ultimately under the work that various people do, was you'll know at the moment that all of the livestock are sort of, the paddocks have names here for the animals, right? There's a donkey paddock, there's a cow paddock, there was an alpaca paddock, there's horse paddock. It's like, no, shouldn't work that way, right? So what's happening then when you have animals just marauding around, it's awfully unnatural. See, all of these herbivores which have eyes on the side of their head, why do they have eyes on the side of their head? Because they have the widest field of vision, because they've got animals with eyes at the front of their head looking at them, wanting to kill them. Whether it's that little big versions of that little thing that's running around or whatever else, right? So the placement of the eyes tells you what that animal is in the trophic levels, right? So they're all preyed upon. And what happens when you have, as you can see here, what are these animals displaying? They're displaying herd behavior. So they're all in tight, and animals who are all in tight behave differently. They use their feet, the way they move their feet is a lot different. So in this case, what we're doing is this pasture has, whilst it's still, whilst it's okay, it had very low levels of ground cover. And that's something I'd invite any of you to go out and look at. You can look at a pasture and think, gee, there's lots of grass. Is there ground cover? You go, yeah, of course there's grass that's this high. Of course there's ground cover. Get down under the soil. Get your snorkel out. Right? Get down low, and you'll see that there might only be 30% ground cover. There's lots of plants, but down on the soil surface, there's no litter. So there's no nutrient exchange. If it rains, you wonder, gee, how come all of this rain runs off, all of this brown water's running off all of this pastured green land? It's because there's no soil surface cover. It's because a lot of time people are grazing with their animals all out there everywhere with no density, and there's no trampling of the residual forage that they're not eating, which is where we get the litter down, right? And so that's why these animals were put in at this density, because what you can do with grazing is you can use stock density as a tool to either for various outcomes. So they wanted to create a no-dig garden across a 50-acre paddock, right? Well, how do you do that? Well, you get 7,000 people to bring bales of straw and lay it all out nicely and put manure down and blah, blah, blah. Or you get a big mob of cows and bunch them up tightly and just smash it down and shit everywhere. Right? You've immediately got a no-dig. So that's what's going on here. So we can use animals really creatively and effectively across the largest of landscape scales. Similarly, this is at a client, one of our best friends, got a few clients who've become really good friends. We've hardly exchanged $1 with this property. From the start, they produce really good salami, and if I'm a sucker for something at salami, look at poor Danny there. She's going, what animals can I kill? I need some salami. Yeah. So we have a salami economy. It doesn't pay the mortgage, but it's a good economy. Or a Christmas ham. We get our Christmas hams from these people in exchange for consultancy and design work. Anyway, so we've set this place up. Now, this is a pastured pig property. It's one of I think it's the best pastured pig property I've seen in the world. What they do is they have some rules so they produce close to, I think it's about 3,500, 3,600 pigs a year off a 500 acre, 200 odd hectare landscape. The whole landscape is fenced using keyline principles. So we've got all the fences so that the fall on the fences is always from the valley to the ridges. And all of the infrastructure apart from the fencing is portable. So all of the pigs are held within temporary fences with portable water systems. So it's a plug and play water system. So we've only, you don't have troughs everywhere. You have a trough per pig group, and the trough moves with that pig group. All of the feeders are portable. All of the buildings are portable. And so that supports, because this is part of this game that we've struggled with in agriculture. We've struggled to practice biomimicry. Pigs. If you see pigs out in their natural environment, they're always on the move. They have a bit of a dig here, and you can go into a paddock and say, "Gee, I've seen the pigs have been here," but they don't do it across the whole paddock. They just do a mosaic here, there, everywhere. And it's those mosaics, just as any of you who have been in a forest would have observed, that when a tree falls over in a forest, it creates a mosaic of disturbance, which is very different to when someone goes in and does industrial forestry and clears the whole thing as a clear cut, right? What we do all the time, we clear cut in agriculture. So we clear cut with disc plows. We go and cut the whole thing all at once. Our mate over the road here, last night he was out there with his mower. He's effectively not practicing a mosaic. He's basically doing the whole thing. When Andrew does his grazing, he's grazing in a mosaic. He hasn't got all of his animals in one paddock for too long, where there's no mosaic. He's in there for a day or two or three or four, and then he's moving on to the next place. And so that creates a mosaic of disturbance. And it's unlikely he'll come back to wherever his cows are today. This time next year, those cows will probably not be back at that same place, right? Whereas some people manage it so they are, "Oh, that's my spring paddock." So they bring their cows back to the spring paddock. And when you do, this as vegetable producers here before me here, a lot of your vegetable, you practice crop rotation. Crop rotation is a version of mosaic disturbance, because if you grow the same annual crop in the same area year after year or cycle after cycle, of course, you're going to get all sorts of diseases occur. So mosaic disturbance regimes are really important. Again, Joel Salatin says that it's important for us to have disturbance. He brings it back to a marriage. He says it's important to have a disturbance in a marriage, because the making up is so nice, but it's what challenges us that allows us to continue. I saw a statistic on that, interestingly. I'll just try and bring this forward, because I think that there's a lot of parallels in what we've talked about today. I think that a lot of what we see with what we do with soils has a lot of what we do with ourselves. And there's starting to be, many of you will be aware of this now, there's starting to be an emerging body of evidence and discussion about the relationship between the biome of the soil and the biome of our gut, and how we're, the closer we get those things sorted and understood, the better off we'll be in terms of human health, and you could say to an extent livestock health, etc. And I think the similarities too are with where's the mosaic disturbance regime in humans? Well, I was talking to a friend recently who's a very close friend of my wife, and Lisa and her had some words. And I said, and she came up to me and she was a bit upset about it. And I said, "Darling, it's okay. The best friends have hard words from time to time." Because a lot of people go along now, they have words with friends and then that's the end, right? Or they have hard words in their relationship and that's the end. And it doesn't need to be that way. A robust relationship, just like a robust ecosystem, should be able to tolerate that. And I recently heard of some psychological from psychological literature that the most successful relationships have a proportion of that. I think it was out of relationships which fail can be determined by the number of negative and positive interactions. And then if you, I don't know that remember, but exactly, but if you have, say, if out of every 10 interactions that you have with whomever, if 10 out of 10 are positive, then that relationship will probably not last. If 3 or 5 out of 10 are negative over a journey, then that relationship will not last. But if you have a few negative, because it's really the negative which challenges the positive, then that relationship is likely to last. And the reason for that, when you think about it, is because that relationship is getting challenged. Relationships which aren't challenged get boring, and landscapes which aren't challenged also get boring, and they lack challenge, and they fall into, and nature doesn't work on the principle of homeostasis. It's dynamic. Fukuoka said this, and the great farmer, philosopher, microbiologist Masanobu Fukuoka, he made that point very clear in One Straw Revolution, is, you know, that you want to have this dynamic stability, because stability is not something that just happens. It has, stability has to be built on some sort of dynamism, and the same, you would say, goes for our relationships. So some form of ecological challenge. What are the ways that we create that disturbance? Well, as I said before, we can have hyper disturbance, which in agriculture, particularly crop-based agriculture, is the norm, where we do lots of cultivation, or we use lots of, these days we use herbicides which minimize they take out the need to do cultivation, but they are a form of disturbance because they upset the energy flows into the soil, and they upset a lot of the microbial processes that are going. So you could say that is a pretty big form of disturbance, and we're starting to understand more and more about how that works out. But then you've got plants. Plants are a form of disturbance. This is a great one. That's called a thistle. And thistles, people will look at thistles and go, ah! They're the worst, they're the worst things you've ever seen. Or other pest, what you might call weed plants or pest plants or whatever, without actually appreciating what they're doing, appreciating that they too, like us, have had an evolutionary pathway which has put them in places. I find weeds fascinating because they just turn up, and they'll turn up in the most fantastic of places, and you wonder, how the bloody hell did they get there? And then you talk to people who know such things, and they say, well, you look at the seeds in the soil, and there's so much seed that's just sitting there waiting for its moment, waiting for its ecological opportunity. And so thistles, you did a little bit too much disturbance. You had the animals on for a bit too long. You put on a bit too much nitrogen. There'll be something that'll create this circumstance, and up they come. And you, of course, being a human, you start you're hitting yourself in the head with a hammer, and so you go and reach for the aspirin, right? As opposed to going and actually just grabbing this hand and putting it down and removing the hammer from your hand, And when we look at the thistle emerging, of course, we go, oh, bloody thistle. It's the thistle's fault that it's here, right? So I better go and control that, go and get my hoe, go and get my probably spray, whatever, and spray it out without actually questioning, what did I do? What was my role in the thistle being there? Why are my animals sick? Oh, must be something. Must be something wrong with the animal. Yeah. What about what's wrong with you and what you're doing to that animal, right? So there's all of these things, this cause and effect dynamic, and how humans, especially modern humans, I think, for various reasons, and I think this goes into the whole entitlement thing that's going on at the moment as well, that people look at effects, not causes. They don't take responsibility, in other words, for what's going on in their lives enough. So we use disturbance as a means of getting things going. So if we've got pastures or if we've got circumstances that we want to improve, one of the big things that we've learned more recently has been the power of cover crops, and how that they, when we give a pulse of annual plant life into perennial plant systems, how that can really speed up the development of soil life and the development of soil itself. And so we've developed some machinery that helps do that, and others have too. On a broader scale, people are doing that with using livestock, as we talked about before. So, you know, instead of having their animals all over the joint, pooling them all together to get that, and then developing these regimes such as pasture cropping. So here we're using, this is up in central New South Wales, and a group of really innovative producers up there. So this is part of a herd of 5,000 sheep that are all bunched together really tight, right? So, you know, they, with all of their feet, all of their manure, all of their urine, all concentrated in one place at one time. And they're eating everything. So nothing is either not eaten or trampled, right? So you get this non-selective grazing pattern. Then they go in this case, they've got a salt. So this is a Mitsubishi Triton Ute, which has got a 150 kilowatt motor. And I was telling you about this yesterday, Scott. How are you, mate? So this has got a 150 kilowatt engine in it, and it's got a battery pack in the back of the ute, and that's all powered or recharged by the solar panels which are on the roof of the shed. And it pulls a no-till seeder. So the no-till seeder, it drags through this pasture which has been fertilized by this mob of sheep and smashed down, and so it's been prepared. You run through with this drill, and then that grows a crop. One of my clients did this in amongst his olive grove down near Ballarat in Victoria. That's a barley crop that he grew in between. And then after you've done that, because you haven't killed what's already there, and because you've played with the cycles of plants, because some plants live in summer, some plants are active in winter, when you play that, you can go and grow your crop to whatever average is coming in the region. And then when you come up, you've got a full body of grass that's come up underneath, that's now that's woken from its dormancy. And now you're practicing what Christine Jones calls year-round green farming. And so a lot of the droughts that we see in a lot of areas, I went to Colin Seiss's place in October last year, and it was drought affected, you know, not enough rain, but he still had green growth because he had a body of carbon, and he was going to take a hit on his crops this year, and because he put so little into it, he was going to still, if it wasn't worth taking the crop off, he was still going to be able to bring his sheep in, and they were going to be able to eat it, so still be able to get along. But that process is all contributing to a development of soil. Cover crops, where you're just growing them. This is at McIver Farm. We're growing cover crops to not only, so the pigs go through, we then go and drag the no-till through, and we grow this mixture of cover crops which grow up, and then they provide a supplement to the pigs, but they also take up all of the nutrient that the pigs have put down and cycle it in situ instead of it all running off and going into a creek nearby, into the water supply. And in doing so, so this is, you know, unheralded, we've been able to get down about 6 inches of soil development per year whilst growing pigs. Now, most people think of pigs, or if you go to a free-range pig system where it's just set stock pigs, you don't get soil development in that. You get soil erosion in that. So, you know, again, it's about that mosaic of disturbance and getting different methods and combining them, that integrationalist mindset of methods that will get you going there. All right, well, we're getting towards the end, time-wise and otherwise. A few books that are on that, which I find really useful, just on that particular topic, and Man, Cattle and Veldt by Johann Zeitzman. I've got another book to add into here, which I haven't put in this presentation, but I'll talk about that at the end. Salad Bar Beef by Joel Salatin, and particularly if you're interested in beef. So these are really about beef production and doing that economically and kicking the hay habit, because that's another thing. When you produce hay and sell that off a property, which a lot of people do, then you're exporting vegetation that hasn't had an animal consume it and cycle it. And so you're exporting a lot of mineral off your property. And plus, you're spending a lot of money that you may not otherwise need to spend, because hay is generally something that you need to either make or buy, and it has a high cost. So how can you create a system that doesn't need that? So, so just to come back to the cover crops, this is Gabe Brown. Gabe Brown's property is, or Brown's Ranch in North Dakota, is pretty well known these days, and he's done the monitoring. And so because they've done the monitoring, and this is what I'd say, you know, what a great time here at this property to get some baseline monitoring, because otherwise in 24 years time, you wouldn't be able to create this really compelling graph, which sort of you look at and you go, oh, wow, that's really clear, that pathway. And I want some of that too, right? So, so over that 24 years, it shows what they've done. So in 1993, they were doing no-till and they had 1.7% organic matter. Then they went 1995. They had they went to 2% because they changed some of their methods, right? So they're still in the sort of agronomic world here. Then they've gone 97. They've started to integrate cover crops, and organic matter has started to increase. Multi-species, so they've diversified the species that are in their cover crops, and accordingly that's increased. When does the big lift happen? Because up to this time, they're vegetarian. It's when they brought livestock in, and all of those processes, those wondrous processes that occur within an animal's gut, and that we can start to have this mosaic go on. And as a result, where they are in 2013, they're up to 11, right? I would doubt that you would have any soils on this property, and most people watching this would not have probably 6 or let alone 11% organic matter or carbon in their soils. I know that that's different. In this case, Ray, because I know you're about to type something, that they're looking at organic carbon. There's a bit of fluidity on that reference in different quarters. So really, really high levels of organic carbon. So what does that soil do? Well, a soil, every percent increase in soil carbon equals 144,000 litres of extra soil water that's stored, right? So you take your soil from 1% or 2% up to 11%. You've got 8% soil carbon. It's about 1 million litres of water that's stored in the soil. That's an Olympic swimming pool for every 100 by 100. Think of an Olympic swimming pool. It's 50 metres by 25 metres by about 2 metres of average depth, right? So that's a huge amount of water that's being kept, that's locked on. And you sort of think, what the hell are we not doing here? What the hell are we not getting here? And what the hell is this whole drought policy stuff about, right? Again, what is it doing? What's drought policy largely doing? it's largely delivering outcomes that treat the effect, not the cause. And we see it time after time after time. But unfortunately, there's a growing body of policymakers out there who are starting to say, actually, sorry, let's start working on some of these causes now. And we've been involved in some of that, and that's some of that's been really great. I'd invite any of you to have a look on our website or on our podcast. We've got a podcast with Helen Lewis, who's a holistic manager, and she's a cattle grazier with her husband up near Warwick in Queensland. And she's also involved with Ag Force, which is an organisation in Queensland, and it's kind of like they're kind of like their Farmers Federation up there, and they're developing a new holistic agriculture-based drought policy, which works on the causes, not on the effects. And so hopefully that over time will result in, instead of farmers finding themselves in these positions where, they and their families and their landscapes and their livestock and their systems are under incredible duress, that yes, they will have a decline in production, but it won't see some of the cataclysmic and effects that it currently does, because people keep not addressing the true root causes. And that a lot of that's all painted out in what we've talked about here today. So I'll move along from that. So today, a few of us are going to be involved in the initiation of a grazing plan for this particular property. And so, now we're talking about how do we develop if we're going to pull all of this together, what's the operating system? Now, most of you who are born post late 80s, early 90s have known nothing more than seeing the world through the lens of various operating systems, right? And so that's the language I use here, is that a grazing plan is an operating system for a farm. You probably already have crop plans for your and different people would have crop plans for garden beds, and you're going to have this happen here and this happen there and that happen there. Well, that's it. As we talked about here yesterday, that's assuming that a garden bed, which is growing vegetables, is always going to just grow vegetables. How does it fit in with the meta plan and the meta landscape that is a farm? If you listen to if we take heed of what we've just talked about today, then that garden should have some time out from being a garden, right? There should be some other phase. But how do we organise all of that? Well, the only method that I've been able to come up with or find is the holistic grazing plan. And the holistic grazing plan allows us, and I'll just get out of this so I can zoom in. What it allows us to do is to combine time and space together. Time, space, and activity, you might say. So, and determine what's the best activity. What they would say in holistic management is, in grazing, you're putting the animals in the right place at the right time for the right reason. Now, if we think of that in a more of a mixed farming scenario, where your enterprise is not just growing animals, you're a vegetable grower, you're a fruit grower, you're a cattle producer or whatever, you've got chickens, etc. How do you pull all of that together into some sort of plan so that you get all of the integrated outcomes that obviously are valuable? And so we're looking at saying, all right, what's the best activity in the right place at the right time? So you might say, well, right now, we've got that soil into a state which it's the best time for it to grow vegetables, right? For example, and to be in that vegetable phase for a while. But there'll be a point where you look at that soil and you go, gee, I'm going to have to go and import a whole lot of compost to go on. And where do I get the compost from? Well, you're either getting it from someone who's used diesel to make it, or what do? you put that system into cover crop, into livestock, build it back up again. So that's the right activity for the right purpose. And what energy have you used? Nothing, right? You've just used what's generally freely available. And so instead of using diesel, and that's where properties like this one, a lot of you who are mixed producers can really start to sing and start to reduce your consumption of fossil energy and human energy for that matter. Because some of you will be doing this using pitchforks and making compost. And hey, Jay, isn't it great we're making compost? It's like, why don't you just use the root systems of plants and the right plant assemblies at a time? Why don't you do that? It takes a lot less energy, but you know, we're not necessarily thinking in that way because most people, if they're doing gardening, then gardening is a separate, completely separate activity to livestock, to orchardry, to this, to that. And you know what I think what we're all appreciating, we're in a period now where we're starting to become a lot more integrationalist, and you know, starting to behave like nature behaves, which is the ultimate integrator. So a grazing plan really helps with that. What we generally do is we look at a calendar. Now, there's 2 calendars in a year. One calendar will be for the growing season and the other will be for the non-growing season. So in the growing season, we're appreciating that when we graze or when we do something, then whatever we're eating will grow back. And if it's growing back, well then how long will it be before we can safely come back? What does that even mean? We can safely come back when the root systems that have been compromised by the consumption of the leaf area above have completely recovered. That's when you've got full plant recovery. So similarly, you know, if you are growing lettuces and you've got one of those lettuces which you can cut and it will grow back, well, there's a time at which you can come back and cut it again, right? If you come back too soon, you might get 2, 3, 4 flushes. If you're growing silver beet, anyone who's perennialized silver beet will know that you can come back and cut it. If you come back too soon, well, you compromise that root system of its stored starch reserves, and it can't keep recovering because you are not replenishing the battery of starch. And so the plant dies, or it withers and gets really weak and gets eaten by something. So yeah, we understand this in the different domains of what we're doing. And so that's part of what we do there. And if we're trying to do this, and this is where it's going to be fun for a property like this, ultimately, I think what we'll probably start with this property, just to describe to the listeners out there that this property is has got grazing, horticulture. Horticulture is made up of tree crops, so mostly fruit trees, and then there's a horticulture with row crop vegetable production. They're the 3 main sort of agricultural streams here. So I think that to keep things simple to start with, I think we'll probably have a grazing plan which just focuses on the grazing systems. That is the areas where there's grass, because it's no point coming into a new system and getting too complex too early. It just puts too much pressure on everyone. So let's get that going, and then we might come back and look at this in 6 months' time or 12 months' time when you're doing your next annual grazing plan. You've got things a bit bedded in, and then you'll go, okay, now I'm ready to bring the veggies into this. Now I'm ready to bring the other horticulture into it. I've got my systems a bit better set up. I've got my humans are a bit better set up, and now we're ready to pull a bit more in together. There's some of the things. But what I might still do, one of the exercises that we have today, and you will all have when you do a grazing plan, is that you've got to set up all of your paddocks or each of the areas. So on any farm, there's going to be areas which are devoted to some form of production, or you might say out of production. Like you might say there's forest on the property. Well, we're not going to include that maybe. We might include it in forests, in grazing, if it's of the right slope and so on. But let's say that we're not, so it won't be included. So we'll look at all of the production areas, we'll give them a name. So paddock 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it is that it is. We'll assign an area to it because we've got to look at this spatially. So remember I said it's a time and space thing that we're managing here. And then we'll look at, in terms of grazing production, we'll look at the relative paddock quality and quantity. So I equate this to bread. If I was to put a kilo block of pumpernickel on the table here and give you all, if I gave you each a slice of pumpernickel and I gave you each a slice of white bread, which one are you going to have to come back to after you've finished the slice to have your next slice? The white, because you're not going to have been nourished. It's taken up the same surface area as a slice, but one just goes thud. Of course, it'd have to be a gluten-free pumpernickel being here. Sorry, did I bring up the B word, the bread word? Butter, bread. Meet me down the front. Yeah, so it's the same with pastures. You'll go to some pastures and some, they might have all of this bulk and whatnot. So they're like the fluffy white bread, but they're empty. And we see that a lot, especially in tropical systems or tropical, subtropical grasses. There's a lot of them, but there's nothing in them. So they're not pumpernickel pastures. So that's something that we've got to, and that generally equates to the soil quality. So if you have, and that's one of the great things about this whole method, I think. And one thing that I recommend to new farmers in particular, or people who are going on to new properties, if you're going to do anything at all, just run a grazing plan for the year. And the reason for that is it'll do all of your site analysis. You'll get completely direct feedback. If you monitor everything that you've done, as you should, then you'll be able to know everywhere because if you've got grass on it, because grasslands are incredibly responsive to environmental conditions, like they change radically. They're quite remarkable. So if you've got grass that for some reason kept those goats, those goats were able to stay satiated on that area for longer than they were on the next block over here, then that tells you something about the soil right there. You're also able to listen to it. You're able to say, gee, it's wet here. Oh, right. Well, you're able to, whereas if you just go and do a site analysis where you look over a place, you can do that as best you can, but you can only get so much information. And that really goes in with, again, the great Fukuoka's expression, which is, to apply protracted and thoughtful observation, not thoughtless and hasty action. So, I know a lot of people get trained in permaculture. I was myself, and other methodologies. And, the site analysis tools and techniques that are recommended to us are pretty good, but they're not longitudinal enough, in my opinion. And what it also has a lot of people do is go in and jump in and do things too early. Whether they go and try and fix up a hydrological problem, which is generally one of the key problems that places have, fix up the water by going and getting in the earth moving equipment straight away, as opposed to, as I've got in a passage in my book, in the water chapter, going in and doing a bit of hydrotherapy and a bit of massage, maybe a bit of acupuncture, a bit of rehydration, a bit of moisturizer. Drink some bloody water, right? Infiltrate, get all of that sort of thing happen, bear witness to that, and then come back and say, do I need to swale? Do I need to dam? Do I need to do all of these different things, right? Is that the right place for my vegetable garden, or for those pecans, or for this, that, and the other? Going through that process will often reveal that to you. And also, which I think is a really good point, most people who buy properties or who get this new body of language or program are really keen to get going. And that's a really dangerous period, because what can happen right then is you can blow a lot of capital really, really quickly. Whereas if you just take a chill pill and just go and do a bit of grazing, or go and use someone else's animals, or however it works for you, and get that going, you are embedding into yourself a different way of approaching landscape management, and also a different way of managing yourself. You're not going to rush forward. And again, you're going to work on those effects more, because you're going to be responding to the effects. You're going to be responding to the causes more, not to the effects. Because if you come in not looking well enough, you're generally going to rush in, and you're going to put fences in everywhere, and dams and swales and trees, and all the noisy shit that's out there. And you're going to have a noisy system, and your life will be noisy. And noisy lives, if you like living in a festival 24/7, good luck to you. All right. So finally, full scale present. I just wanted to deal with, because there was a couple of things here I wanted to deal with livestock that are important. Graham Hand, who we work with, great fellow, he developed these scales. So a lot of people, when they're working, there's quite a few of you will work with livestock in your lives, and some of you won't, and so overlook this. But a lot of people don't know, like there's a whole narrative out there that gets pushed in livestock management, that you need to move your cows every day, or you need to move your animals every day, right? That's a really big narrative. And so a lot of young people, or people who switch over to this, that becomes, they've heard that from a God, and so, that means I have to read the Bible every day before I go to bed. I have to say my prayers, right? Or whatever it's going to be, right? Or in this case, I need to move my animals every day, right? Now, unfortunately, that's wrong. Because that's not site specific. It's a method that doesn't pay attention to the intricacies that occur within any ecology, and it doesn't pay attention to another thing. Harry Weir from Kiwi Tech, the fencing and water supply company, when he opens up his presentation on his farm, he says, "Apologies to anyone out there who's religious, but my God is productivity." But when he goes on, he says, well, what does that mean? His God is utilization, whilst not compromising my economy, and not compromising my landscape, and whilst not compromising my animal health. And so in doing that, he's just like Graham is looking at here, although Graham's developed this really well for people, is putting different scores on things. People all respond to different things in different ways in the way we're learning. And it's really helpful, I think, when you're transitioning over into new methods, to have scores and that sort of thing. So you can sort of simplify matters for you. So what are the 5 scores of grass recovery, right? So that's helpful, as opposed to me saying, oh, you should be waiting until the grass's roots are fully recovered, or that you've done this and that. Why don't you just have a simple score with some metrics which determine that score? So you can walk in and go, yeah, I think we're still at score 3, or we're still at score 2. Now, in this place here, if we had a few people who are involved in the grazing program here, and this was part of your language, you're going up the lane to go and do something else, and then when you come together as the grazing group or whatever, or just when you're sitting down at the table, you say, yeah, I think the paddock number 17 is probably score 3 at the moment. It's still got a way to go. Yeah, good. All right, great. Into the body of knowledge starts to become part of the lingua franca of an operation, or of yourself if it's just you're doing these things yourself. Similar with poo. Right? You take a dump, you should look at it. Most people go and have a look, right? Well, you should be looking at your cow manure as well. I heard, Andrew, you were talking, not from you, but indirectly, that you were had made some observations on some manure, and well, you know, as a producer, that what happens at the end of an animal can tell you a lot about that animal's health. Not only that animal's health, because the animal is a direct conduit between the landscape, it's basically telling you what the landscape health is as well. And whether you've got that animal on there for too long or too short or whatever it's going to be. And so there is, just like there is with us, you know, they say golden brown and floats and blah, 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 all of that. People, I don't know if there's a little color thing that you can go in there and test it all out. But there, in livestock, there's an ideal poo. And that poo tells you a lot about what's going on. Tells you whether, like it says here, with planned grazing, this indicates a good match between the grass being selected and the rumen conditions. Animals are at a low risk of metabolic diseases and health is generally good, right? And you get this biscuit-like deep, you know, what does it mean? You know, you get a sheep shit when you go to the toilet, probably haven't had enough water. Same with animals. They probably had too much fiber and not enough water, and so they produce this discus, which I used to delight in throwing at my brother or something, or cousins, when I was a kid. And then you've got the other end, you know, if you've got the diarrheic, watery poo, and what does that tell you, and so on. So there's different scores there. And again, you don't have to go and say, oh, it's a pie or that. You can just describe the poos that you see through a score, right? You can do the same with sheep, goats, all animals, right? They all tell you a story. So a lot of you will have seen in your time, anytime you've seen a sheep farm, how many times have you seen a poo like that? Right? Most times we see individual pellets. Most people think that that's why we call it sheep poo. Right? You take a dump and say, oh, gee, I've done a sheep poo today. Not because it looks like that, because it looks like that, right? So yeah. That's because most people aren't managing their sheep in a way that produces the right poo. There you go. Same with the rumen. So ruminant animals have a thing called a rumen, and so up on the left-hand side of the animal, if it's deeply depressed, and we see a lot of that up here, down in Victoria, we don't see anywhere near as much because the grasses in Victoria are much more nutritious because they're winter-active grasses. Cool season grasses tend to, even when they're dry, they start off with more nutrition, and even when they're dry, they hold on to more nutrition. Come up into the tropics, and it's mostly summer active or warm season grasses, and they're what some people will call low octane grasses, and they don't have as much nutrition. So those animals can eat as much as they like, and they just don't fill up, right? Because it's all white bread. So that's an important thing. So if I was to decide when to move an animal, looking at the animal and its rumen will tell me when it's time to move. And getting this balance between trying to see, like, and this is, some of you will witness this as you work on your own farms or here, you'll see that you'll look at an animal and when it's going through this new method of grazing that will apply, and you'll go, right, and you'll look at it and you go, well, are most of them just about to have a rumen that's mildly sunken? Well, if it's mildly sunken, it means it's not getting anything out of that ground anymore, so it's time to move. But you may have moved that animal at a time when it hasn't got to that point. And so that means you're leaving a lot behind, right? And so that can mean over the year, that might mean 10 extra cows of grazing, right? Or 10 extra goats of grazing that you are now missing out. Right? That's a lot of production that you're missing out on. So, and this is all stuff that starts off being something that you're laser focused on, and like any form of learning, everyone will start off being a fool when they start, but then ultimately you'll look at this and it'll be second nature to you. So you just got to relax on that. Realize that when you start off anything, you're going to be a fool. And just understand that that's okay. Like when you first walked, we all, your parents all stood and kind of were happy, but at the same time they were laughing at how ridiculous you looked when you were trying to walk, or when you tried to ride that bike. Everyone's standing around going, oh, look at them trying to ride and fall off, and you're sort of going, oh, caring, but look at the way they fell, right? You'll get that with anything that you do. So that's just something to understand. All right, for those of you who aren't in this room, your task work this week will be, as usual, to assess your existing soils, look at the types, capability, condition, and try and go through. We'll share with you, I think we might already have them, but the templates for the holistic management grazing plans. But anyway, look at your different paddocks and try and give some sort of understanding as to what quality they have and what quantity they, quality and ratings. Secondly, analyze the opportunities for use, and that's going to be maybe a secondary thing that you look at. Go back to the discussion on site analysis that we had, which I think was on week 5, where we were looking at, all right, well, where will we do agronomic soil testing and where will we do geotechnical testing? So if you've got any dams coming up or anything that you've done in the water layer, well, then you might look at that. Look at the bullseye, so study those pages of the Agrarian's Handbook, and also look at the landscape function work. There's a fair bit of that in the soils group page on the Agrarian's Workplace that you can look at. And also take a look at some of the 10-week Rex webinars that Graham Hand delivered, where he talked about landscape function a bit more deeply than I did today. In terms of Google Earth Pro, the soils layer. The soils layer is largely going to be where you build a layer on the different soil types that you have on the property, and so you'll do your best on that. And then annotate each of those and then share that folder when the time comes. Otherwise, for references, obviously this is a field in which there are a lot of different references, a lot, and quite noisy and from different gods, and some of those are here now before us. So Charlie Massey has done an amazing job in, I think, probably the world's first general profile of the regenerative agricultural producers, because that's how I see the call of the reed warbler. It's really it's a set of profiles of different producers and the things that they've found and the things that they do and how they do it. It's a really, if anybody hasn't read that, I think it's a must-have. If you want to know more about soil minerals and that sort of thing, well, there's 3 books there that I've listed. Neil Kinsey's Hands-on Agronomy. I was trained by Neil in the 90s, and he's a really great fellow. And he was trained himself by Dr. William Albrecht, who's one of the greatest soil scientists that lived and was in the organic space. Gary Zimmer is a producer in Wisconsin, and he follows the Albrecht method as well. But his method, particularly for those who are involved in crop-based agriculture, really important. Anyone who's involved in organic agriculture, I would highly recommend that they get a copy of this book, which has been out in Spanish for about 15 or 20 years, by Jairo Estrepo, The ABC of Organic Agriculture. If you want to know where to get that, contact me through the workplace, or Danny here. We can talk about how to get one or copies here for Conscious Ground. It has all of the recipes of how, if you want to get to basically make all of your own fertilizers, your own phosphates, your own limes, your own sulfurs, your own microbes, how to gather microbes, how to do all sort, how to create your own mycorrhizal fungi mixes, where to harvest them, how to harvest them. it's chock-a-block. It's a really, really great book that allows you to basically be fertility independent, which is something that in the industrial period, farmers have had their fertility independence completely stripped away from them. And you have to buy it all. And, you know, yeah, anyway. Then we've got teaming with nutrients and teaming with microbes. They're two really straightforward pieces which should be in the library of any organic producer, so that we can just so that you can understand what's going on a bit more clearly. And Holistic Management Handbook is there. It's got the guides as to how to develop holistic grazing plans, and also holistic financial plans and holistic land plans. Although holistic land planning is not what I would call a strong suit of the holistic management network or practice. And so we recommend people look at, as they do, look at the Regrarians platform, and Regrarians as being, and the way we get about things as far as land planning is concerned. So that's all I have, I think, for today. So thanks very much to our friends here at Conscious Ground for joining us, and only a couple of them fell asleep, but that's a learning style issue, and that's okay. That's my issue for not presenting that in a way that appeals to your learning style. And to all of our friends online from wherever they are, and we look forward to yet another week in the workplace. So thank you very much, and hoping to get to having a grazing plan done. Giddy up. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, Danny. Thank you, team. Team CG. And meeting. That work? No, didn't work. No. Ah, that's what's making it work. Now we go. And meeting.